The European exploration of Australia was the exploration of Australia by Europeans, encompassing several waves of seafarers and land explorers. The first documented encounter was that of Dutch navigator Willem Janszoon. In 1606, Dutch seafarers visited the west and north coasts of the continent, as did French explorers. However, the most famous of the explorers was that of Royal Navy Lieutenant James Cook 164 years after the Janszoon sighting, who after an assignment to make observations of the 1769 Venus transit, followed Admiralty instructions to explore the South Pacific for the reported Terra Australis, and on the 19th of April 1770 sighted the southeastern coast of Australia and became the first recorded European to explore the eastern coastline. Explorers by land and sea continued to survey the continent for some years after settlement. Theories of Portuguese and French discovery. Some writers have advanced the theory that the Portuguese were the first Europeans to sight Australia in the 1520s. A number of relics and remains have been interpreted as evidence that the Portuguese reached Australia. The primary evidence advanced to support this theory is the representation of the continent of Jave Le Grande, which appears on a series of French world maps, the JEP maps, and that may, in part, be based on Portuguese charts. However, most historians do not accept this theory, and the interpretation of the JEP maps is highly contentious. The French navigator by not Paul Mire de Gonville claimed to have landed at a land he described as east of the Cape of Good Hope in 1504, after being blown off course. For some time it had been thought he discovered Australia, but the place he landed has now been shown to be Brazil. 17th century explorers. The most significant exploration of Australia in the 17th century was by the Dutch. The Dutch East India Company was set up in 1602 and traded extensively with the islands which now form parts of Indonesia, and hence were very close to Australia already. The first documented and undisputed European sighting of and landing on Australia was in late February or early March 1606, by the Dutch navigator Willem Janszoon aboard the Doofken. Janszoon followed the coast of New Guinea, missed Torres Strait, and explored and then charted part of the western side of Cape York, in the Gulf of Carpentaria, believing the land was still part of New Guinea. On the 26th of February 1606, Janszoon made landfall near the modern town of Weipa and the Pennefather River, but were promptly attacked by the indigenous people. Janszoon proceeded down the coast for some 350 kilometers. He stopped in some places but was met by hostile natives and some of his men were killed. At the final place, he initially had friendly relations with the natives, but after he forced them to hunt for him and appropriated some of the women, violence broke out and there were many deaths on both sides. These events were recorded in Aboriginal oral history that has come down to the present day. Here Janszoon decided to turn back, the place later being called Cape Keerwit, Dutch for turnabout. The same year, of Spanish expedition sailing in nearby waters and led by Pedro Fernandez de Quiros landed in the New Hebrides and, believing them to be the fabled southern continent, named the land Australia del Espiritu Santo, in honor of his Queen Margaret of Austria, the wife of Philip III of Spain. Later that year, de Quiros' deputy Luis Vieira de Torres sailed to the north of Australia through Torres Strait, charting New Guinea's southern coast, and possibly sighting Cape York in October 1606. In 1611 Hendrik Brouwer, working for VOC, discovered that sailing from Europe to Batavia was much quicker if the Roaring Forties were used. Up to that point, The Dutch had followed a route copied from Arab and Portuguese sailors who followed the coast of Africa, Mauritius and Ceylon. The Brouwer route involved sailing south from the Cape of Good Hope into the Roaring Forties, then sailing east before turning north to Java using the South Indian Ocean current. The Brouwer route became compulsory for Dutch vessels in 1617. The problem with the route, however, was that there was no easy way at the time to determine longitude, making Dutch landfalls on the west coast of Australia inevitable, as well as ships becoming wrecked on the shoals. Most of these landfalls were unplanned. The first such landfall was in 1616, when Dirk Hartog, employed by VOC, reached land at Shark Bay off the coast of Western Australia. Finding nothing of interest, Hartog continued sailing northwards along this previously undiscovered coastline of Western Australia, making nautical charts up to about 22 degrees latitude south. He then left the coast and continued on to Batavia. He called Australia Eiland van Dordrecht after his ship, a name which would be in use until Abel Tasman named the land New Holland in 1644. In 1619 Frederick de Houtman, in the VOC ship Dordrecht, and Jacob de Edel, in another VOC ship Amsterdam, sighted land on the Australian coast near present-day Perth, which they called Dedelsland. After sailing northwards along the coast, they made landfall in Eendrachtsland, which had previously been encountered and named by Hartog. Before turning for Batavia, Hessel Gerrits was appointed on the 16th of October 1617 as the first exclusive cartographer of VOC, whose job included creating and maintaining charts of coastlines in the area. Gerrits produced a map in 1622 which showed the first part of Australia to be charted, that by Janszoon in 1606. It was considered to be part of New Guinea and called Nueva Guinea on the map, but Gerrits also added an inscription saying, "Those who sailed with the yacht of Pedro Fernandez de Queiroz in the neighborhood of New Guinea to 10 degrees westward through many islands and shoals and over 2, 3 and 4 fathoms for as many as 40 days," presumed that New Guinea did not extend beyond 10 degrees to the south. If this be so, then the land from 9 to 14 degrees would be a separate land, different from the other New Guinea. All charts and logs from returning VOC merchants and explorer sailors had to be submitted to Gerrits and provided new information for several breakthrough maps which came from his hands. Gerrits' charts would accompany all VOC captains on the voyages. In 1627 Gerrits made a map, the Cape van Eiland van Dordrecht, entirely devoted to the discoveries of the West Australian coastline, which was named Eendrachtsland, though the name had been used since 1619. On the 1st of May 1622, Englishman John Brooke in the Trial, a British East India Company-owned vessel of approximately 500 tons, on the way to Batavia, was the second English voyage to use Brouwer's southern route. He sailed too far east and sighted the coastline of Western Australia at Point Clotes, although they mistook it for an island sighted in 1618 by Janszoon. They did not land there, and a few weeks later were shipwrecked on an uncharted reef northwest of the Montebello Islands. The shipwreck caused the death of 93 men, but the captain and 9 men survived, and made the way to Batavia by longboat, and later back to England. However, for the next 2 decades, English ships were barred from using the southern route. In 1623, Jan Carstens was commissioned by VOC to lead an expedition to the southern coast of New Guinea and beyond, to follow up the reports of further land sighted by Janszoon in his 1606 voyages to the south. Settling off from Amboina in the Dutch East Indies with 2 ships, the Pera and Arnhem, he travelled along the south coast of New Guinea, then headed south to Cape York Peninsula and the Gulf of Carpentaria. On 14 April 1623 he passed Cape Keerwiller, landing in search of fresh water for his stores. Carstens encountered a party of the local indigenous Australian inhabitants, who he described as poor and miserable-looking people who had no knowledge of precious metals or spices. On 8 May 1623, Carstens and his crew fought a skirmish with 200 Aborigines at the mouth of a small river near Cape Dufcan and landed at the Pennefather River. Carstens named the small river Carpentier River, and the Gulf of Carpentaria in honor of Peter de Carpentier, Governor-General of the Dutch East Indies. Carstens reached the Sodacan River before heading north again. The Pera and Carstens returned to Amboina while the Arnhem crossed the Gulf of Carpentaria, sighting the east coast of Arnhem Land. In 1627, Francois Thijssen ended up too far south, and on 26 January 1627 he came upon the coast of Australia near Cape Lewin, the most southwest tip of the mainland. Peter Knights, the VOC official aboard his ship, gave Thijssen permission to continue to sail eastwards, mapping more than 1,500 kilometres of the southern coast of Australia from Albany, Western Australia, to Ceduna, South Australia. He called the land T-Land Van Peter Knights. Part of Thijssen's map shows the islands St. Francis and St. Peter, now known collectively with the respective groups as the Knights Archipelago. Thijssen's observations were included as early as 1628 by Gerrits in a chart of the Indies and Eendrachtsland. One Dutch captain of this period who was not really an explorer but who nevertheless bears mentioning was Francisco Pelsart, captain of the Batavia, which was wrecked off the coast of Western Australia in 1629. In August 1642, VOC dispatched Abel Tasman and Francois Vischer on a voyage of which one of the objects was to obtain knowledge of all the totally unknown provinces of the Kingdom of Beach. This expedition used two small ships, the Heemskerk and the Zeehaaren. Starting in Mauritius, both ships left on 8 October using the Roaring Forties to sail west as fast as possible. On 7 November, because of snow and hail, the ship's course was altered to a more northeastern direction. On 24 November 1642, Abel Tasman sighted the west coast of Tasmania, north of Macquarie Harbour. He named his discovery Van Diemen's Land after Antonio van Diemen, Governor-General of the Dutch East Indies. Proceeding south, he skirted the southern end of Tasmania and turned northeast. Tasman then tried to work his two ships into Adventure Bay on the east coast of South Bruny Island, where he was blown out to sea by a storm. This area he named Storm Bay. 2 days later, Tasman anchored to the north of Cape Frederick Hendrick, just north of the Forsythia Peninsula. Tasman then landed in Blackmond Bay, in the larger Marion Bay. The next day, an attempt was made to land in North Bay. However, because the sea was too rough, the carpenter swam through the surf and planted the Dutch flag in North Bay. Tasman then claimed formal possession of the land on 3 December 1642. In 1644, Tasman made a second voyage with 3 ships. He followed the south coast of New Guinea eastwards, missed the Torres Strait between New Guinea and Australia, and continued his voyage westwards along the North Australian coast. He mapped the north coast of Australia, making observations on the land, which he called New Holland, and its people. For the point of view of the Dutch East India Company, Tasman's explorations were a disappointment. He had found neither a promising area for trade nor a useful new shipping route. A map of the world inlaid into the floor of the Burgerzaal of the New Amsterdam Stadhuis in 1655 revealed the extent of Dutch charts of much of Australia's coast based on the 1648 map by Joan Blaeu. No very accurate Curatissima Terra Morbis Tabula. It incorporated Tasman's discoveries, subsequently reproduced in the map. Archipelagus Orientalis Sive Asiaticus, published in the Kerfersen Atlas. Maps from this period and the early 18th century often have Terra Australis at Zuidland marked as New Holland, the name given to the continent by Abel Tasman in 1644. Joan Blau's 1659 map shows a clearly recognizable outline of Australia based on the many Dutch explorations of the first half of the 17th century. In 1664, the French geographer Melchisedec Taverneau published in Relations to Divers Voyages Curieux a map of New Holland. Taverneau divided the continent in two, between Nova Hollandia to the west and Terra Australis to the east. He divided the continent on a line at longitude 135 degrees east, which appears to have been on his initiative, as there is no such division on Blau's map or on the Amsterdam Town Hall map, or on any other Dutch maps of this period in which Terra Australis at Zuidland appears with the name Hollandia Nova as an alternative name for the whole country. The 135 degrees meridian was the meridian that represented the western limit of Spain's imperial claim in the South Pacific, arising from the Treaty of Tordesillas of 1494, an active possession of the Southland made by Pedro Fernández de Queiroz in 1606. This western limit of Spain's claim is shown on the 1761 map of the Spanish Empire by Vicente de Memilla, Aspecto Simbolico del Mundo Hispanico, and played a part in the British claim and possession of the territory in the late 18th century. Englishman William Dampier came looking for the trial in 1688, 66 years after it was wrecked. Dampier was the first Englishman to set foot on the Australian mainland on 5 January 1688, when his ship the Cygnet was marooned in King Sound. While the ship was being careened, he made notes on the fauna and flora and the indigenous peoples he found there. He made another voyage to the region in 1699, before returning to England. He described some of the flora and fauna of Australia, and was the first European to report Australia's peculiar large hopping animals. Dampier contributed to knowledge of Australia's coastline through his two-volume publication A Voyage to New Holland. His book of adventures, A New Voyage Around the World, created a sensation when it was published in English in 1697. Though he was briefly marooned on the NW Australian coast on the trip described in this book, only his second voyage seems to be of importance to Australian exploration. In 1696, Willem de Vlaming commanded the rescue mission to Australia's west coast to look for survivors of the Ridderschap van Holland that had gone missing 2 years earlier. The mission proved fruitless, but along the way Vlaming charted parts of the continent's western coast and as a result improved navigation on the Indian Ocean route from the Cape of Good Hope to the Dutch East Indies. 18th-century explorers. In 1756, French King Louis XV sent Louis-Antoine de Bougainville to look for the southern lands. After a stay in South America and the Falklands, Bougainville reached Tahiti in April 1768, where his boat was surrounded by hundreds of canoes filled with beautiful women. "I ask you," he wrote, "given such a spectacle, how could one keep at work 400 Frenchmen?" Quote, he claimed Tahiti for the French and sailed westward past southern Samoa and the New Hebrides. Then, on sighting Espiritu Santo, turned west, still looking for the southern continent. On June 4 he almost ran into heavy breakers and had to change course to the north and east. He had almost found the Great Barrier Reef. He sailed through what is now known as the Solomon Islands that, due to the hostility of the people there, he avoided, until his passage was blocked by a mighty reef. With his men weak from scurvy and disease and no way through, he sailed for Batavia in the Dutch East Indies, where he received news of Wallace and Carteret, who had preceded Bougainville. When he returned to France in 1769, he was the first Frenchman to circumnavigate the globe and the first European known to have seen the Great Barrier Reef. Though he did not reach the mainland of Australia, he did eliminate a considerable area where the southern land was not. In 1768, British Lieutenant James Cook was sent from England on an expedition to the Pacific Ocean to observe the transit of Venus from Tahiti, sailing westwards in HMS Endeavour via Cape Horn and arriving there in 1769. On the return voyage he continued his explorations of the South Pacific, in search of the postulated continent of Terra Australis. He first reached New Zealand, and then sailed further westwards to sight the southeastern corner of the Australian continent on the 20th of April 1770. In doing so, he was to be the first documented European expedition to reach the eastern coastline. He continued sailing northwards along the east coast, charting and naming many features along the way. He identified Botany Bay as a good harbour and one potentially suitable for a settlement, and where he made his first landfall on the 29th of April. Continuing up the coastline, the endeavour was to later run aground on shoals of the Great Barrier Reef, where she had to be laid up for repairs. The voyage then recommenced, eventually reaching the Torres Strait and thence on to Batavia. The expedition returned to England via the Indian Ocean and Cape of Good Hope. In 1772, two French expeditions set out to find Terra Australis. The first, led by Marc-Joseph Marion de Fresnay, found and named the Crozet Islands. He spent a few days in Tasmania, where he made contact with the island's indigenous people, and in Blackman's Bay claimed Van Diemen's Land for France. He then sailed on to New Zealand, where he and some crewmen were killed by Maori warriors. The survivors retreated to Mauritius. Also, in 1772, the two ships of the Second French expedition were separated by a storm. The leader turned back, but the second in command, Louis Alino de Saint-Alouin, sighted Cape Leeuwin and followed the Western Australian coast north to Shark Bay. He landed on Dirk Hartog Island and claimed Western Australia in the name of French King Louis XV. Tobias Furneaux on the Adventure accompanied James Cook on Cook's second voyage, which was commissioned by the British government with advice from the Royal Society, to circumnavigate the globe as far south as possible to finally determine whether there was any great southern land mass, or Terra Australis. On this expedition Furneaux was twice separated from his leader. On the first occasion, in 1773, Furneaux explored a great part of the south and east coasts of Van Diemen's Land, and made the earliest British chart of the same. Most of his names here have survived. On Cook's third voyage, in 1777, Cook confirmed Furneaux's account and delineation of it, with certain minor criticisms and emendations, and named after him the Furneaux Group at the eastern entrance to Bass Strait, and the group now known as the Low Archipelago. Cook's first expedition carried botanist Joseph Banks, for whom a great many Australian geographical features and at least one native plant are named. The reports of Cook and Banks in conjunction with the loss of England's penal colonies in America after they gained independence and growing concern over French activity in the Pacific, encouraged the foundation by the British of a colony at Botany Bay. The first fleet, led by Captain Arthur Phillip, left England on the 13th of May 1787 to found a penal colony in Australia. It reached Botany Bay in mid-January 1788. Philip had decided to move the settlement to Sydney Cove in Port Jackson, but the British ships were unable to leave Botany Bay until the 26th of January because of a tremendous gale. Just as he was attempting to move the colony, on the 24th of January 1788, Jean-François de Gallerup, Comte de Leperance, arrived off Botany Bay. The French expedition consisted of 2 ships led by Leperance, which arrived off Botany Bay on the latest leg of a 3-year voyage that had taken them from Brest, around Cape Horn, up the coast from Chile to California, northwest to Kamchatka, southeast to Easter Island, northwest to Macau, and on to the Philippines, the Friendly Isles, Hawaii and Norfolk Island. The gale also prevented Leperance's ships from entering Botany Bay. Though amicably received, the French expedition was a troublesome matter for the British, as it showed the interest of France in the new land. To preempt a French claim to Norfolk Island, Philip ordered Lieutenant Philip Gidley King to lead a party of 15 convicts and 7 free men to take control of Norfolk Island. They arrived on the 6th of March 1788, while Leperance was still in Sydney. The British received him courteously, and each captain, through their officers, offered the other any assistance and needed supplies. Leperance was 6 weeks in Port Jackson, where the French established an observatory, held Catholic masses, performed geological observations, and planted the first garden. Before leaving Sydney on the 10th of March, Leperance took the opportunity to send his journals, some charts and also some letters back to Europe with a British naval ship from the First Fleet, the Alexander. Neither Leperance nor any of his men were seen again. Fortunately, the documents that he dispatched with the Alexander from the in-progress expedition were returned to Paris, where they were published. In September 1791, the French Assembly decided to send an expedition in search of Leperance, and Bruni d'Entrecasteaux was selected to command the expedition. In 1792, d'Entrecasteaux landed and named Esperance in Western Australia and made many more discoveries and named many other places. The expedition suffered many difficulties, with d'Entrecasteaux dying on the 21st of July 1793 of scurvy. On the 18th of February 1794, the expedition vessels were surrendered to the Dutch authorities in the East Indies so that the new French Republican government could not profit by them. Elizabeth Rossel, the most senior surviving officer, sailed from Java in January 1795 on board a Dutch ship, taking with him the expedition's papers. The ship left Rossel at Table Bay but took the papers, but was captured by the British. After the Peace of Amiens in 1802, all the expedition papers were returned to Rossel, who was thus able to publish a narrative of the whole enterprise. In 1808, Rossel published the detailed Voyage de d'Entrecasteaux, Envoyé à la Recherche de Leperance, produced by Charles-François Beautemps-Beaupré. The atlas contains 39 charts, of which those of Van Diemen's Land were the most detailed, and which remained the source of the English charts for many years. His expedition also resulted in the publication of the first general flora of New Holland.